So we're going to start with Jasper Johns, one of the best known of the pop artists. And he effectively lays the foundation for the pop art movement's aesthetic embrace of commodity culture. And he does so with his playful, subversive appropriation of common signs and products. So he will take commonly available signs and ideas and turn them into art. This is taking low art, what we see as commercial, and making it high art. His exploration of semantics and perception also set the stage for both the conceptual art movement and the postmodern movement of the following decades. Rather than direct representation or abstraction, he tends to make signs like flags and targets, the main images in his work. So he's, again, picking things that we're very familiar with, but we don't really pay attention to. The things the mind already knows were his ideal subject because of the host of varied meanings each carried with it. This fostered the perceptual ambiguity and semantic play at the heart of his work. Johns quoted the gesturally evocative abstract expressionist brushstroke, using the idea of the artist's mark as merely another symbol that enhanced the multiplicity of meanings and interpretations in his paintings. Translation: the brush marks are very, very intentional and thought out. They're supposed to increase the perception of an artist creating the work, as opposed to elements of color field, for example, where they try and get rid of it. Like his Dada predecessor and mentor Duchamp, Johns artistically initiated a dialogue in which each artwork that was meant to be resolved within the mind of the viewer. He's presenting you something, you are supposed to come to the conclusion. He is not giving it to you. Through his use of shreds of newspaper, found objects, and even mass-produced goods, like Ballantine ale, Johns erased the division between art and mass culture, between low art and high art. This shifted modern art away from abstraction towards the consumer landscape of the mid-20th century, specifically mid-20th century America. And one of the pieces he's best known for is going to be Flag. So, as he says, one night I was dreaming that I painted a large American flag. And the next morning, I got up, I went out, bought the materials, and began painting it. So what he does here is this is canvas that he mounted on plywood with strips of newspaper, and then he paints over it with encaustic paint. Now, encaustic paint is basically melted wax. It's wax. Today it's paraffin wax mixed with pigment, but it goes back to ancient Egypt when they used beeswax. Now, he chooses the American flag for a reason. The mind already knows it. So the idea here is that the American flag is something we see, well, almost every day, but we never really think of it, do we? We don't put it in the context of art, even though we know someone designed it. So what he's doing is he's taking the flag, something that we're all familiar with, he puts it in a museum, and now suddenly we have to look at that flag as if it's a form of art. We're suddenly forced to look at the design of the stars, the choice of blue for the field on the upper left. Why are there these different red and white stripes? Who came up with the proportions of the flag? Whose idea was it to create this image? Why does the American flag look so different than everyone else's? What were the design choices that went into it? And why don't we think about it as art? So a lot of things kicking off. It's not so much about the piece. It's not so much about the image of the flag, but the conversation that you need to have when you look at it. Starting with, why is it here? And why don't we see the flag, the American flag, as a piece of art? So he had begun to paint common, instantly recognizable symbols, such as the flag. Breaking with the idea of the canvas as a field for abstract expression, he painted things the mind already knows. And he took great care, in the case of the flag, because he didn't have to design it. This gave him room to work on other levels, to focus his attention on making what he does to make the painting. Now, here's an example. Those encaustic paints, you can see that they're very uneven. As we look closer, you'll notice that beneath that paint is newspaper. So the color, for example, is applied not to the canvas, but to strips of newspaper, a material that is so ordinary that we rarely even notice it. In fact, even seeing it here, we kind of sit there and go, yeah, okay, paper mache. That's the first thought for a lot of people. But think about this. This is 1954. Newspaper is highly influential. Whatever the New York Times, the Washington Post, even the Milwaukee Journal says is going to have a huge influence in the community. It's going to influence how we look at that flag. Are we proud of it? Or do we look at it and go, wow, I kind of question whether I'm proud of America right now. And that can be changed through newspaper. Today, you would make the argument that the internet or television have the same power. And these scraps of newspaper are really hard to ignore, although they're intentionally illegible. You can make out words, but you can't really make out a story. Also, instead of using oil paint, Johns chose encaustic, a mixture of pigment and molten wax, which tends to leave lumps and smears, so that even though one recognizes the image in a second, close up, it almost abstracts the image because you start focusing on the textures and the elaborate use of color, the thin points and the thick points. You start looking at it very differently. It is at once impersonal or public, and personal, abstract, and representational all at the same time. And it's demanding of close attention. He's created a situation where the American flag fits perfectly into a modern or contemporary art museum. And he won't create just one of this piece. This is one of numerous flags that he creates, always drawing our attention to this most basic form that we are so familiar with, and yet we never look at it in terms of art.